What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk show here on Touchline Talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I get started, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. Busy show today. There were 400 things I could have talked about. Had to narrow it down. I want to finish my season preview series for Europe's top 5 leagues. Going to do that first, taking a look at the biggest storylines in the Bundesliga, La Liga, Ligue 1, and Serie A. And then, of course, there is a World Cup final to talk about, a full breakdown of England and Spain, what to expect in Sunday's final. Starting, though, segment 1, I want to finish previewing the 5 major leagues in Europe, as I already mentioned. Did an extensive Premier League preview last week. So this week is about the other 4 leagues, starting with the Bundesliga. Just going 3 storylines, kind of the biggest things I'm looking for this season in Germany, Spain, Italy, and France. So, Bundesliga, storyline number 1. It's very simply Bayern Munich from a couple different standpoints. 1, are they better? Because last season was, maybe calling it a train wreck is a slight exaggeration, but it wasn't all that far off. And they found a way to win the league after giving it away. Dortmund handed it back to them. But it was very clear you had 2 different things going on here. You had a decline that was already happening. Their lack of competitiveness in Europe was just decreasing. And you had the departure of Robert Lewandowski. And there was no replacement. Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting scored a bunch of goals in that short period of time, and then other than that, they didn't get really anything. Sadio Mane didn't work. He's already gone. So those 2 things combined to a very, very poor season for Bayern. So this storyline, to me, has 2 different components. The first one is just simply, are Bayern much better? Obviously, Harry Kane is there now. Didn't really get a chance to talk about Harry Kane on video. To me, this is the time to make the move. Is ultimately where I came down on it. Go win trophies now. If you want a peaceful exit from Spurs, this is the way to do it. To leave the league, to not run your contract down. I'm going to talk about that with Mbappe later. To get Spurs money so that you're not causing them headaches, you're not going to a rival, and you're basically guaranteeing yourself trophies at some point here with Bayern. And then, if you want to go back in 2 seasons, whether Spurs or somewhere else, absolutely, you can go back in 3 seasons and still break the Premier League goal scoring record. Obviously, Harry Kane, from a Bayern perspective, brings a whole new dynamic to this attack. Can he get them back to the point where they are contenders to win the Champions League? And then the second part of this. Is there a title race in this league? Can Dortmund or somebody else, probably Dortmund, hang with this Bayern team? Because it's not just Harry Kane that got brought in here. Kim Min-jae, Rafael Guerrero, Konrad Laimer. I'm a huge fan of Kim's, as is just about everybody after what he did for Napoli last season. Rafael Guerrero, you're taking an important player from your biggest rival. Konrad Laimer, they're just, Bayern's continuing to just grab Leipzig midfielders. This is a much better team than last season's. Particularly because Sadio Mane didn't work. So it's not like you lost anything there. And I am incredibly confident Harry Kane is going to be fine. So that's the other part of it, is that Bayern have clearly made a point of saying this is not going to happen again. Can they actually prevent it? And can Borussia Dortmund keep pace with an improved Bayern? Because part of the story last season was that Bayern stooped down to Borussia Dortmund's level. It's not like Dortmund elevated themselves to Bayern's level the way that, for example, Liverpool have with Manchester City in some of those title races. Not the same thing in the Bundesliga last season. So that is storyline 1. Storyline 2, is the tiers. And kind of how does this all play out outside of what I'm calling tier 1? And I have Bayern, Dortmund, and Leipzig in that tier. I'm going to talk about Leipzig in storyline number 3. It's a very different team, but ultimately I just assume they're still going to be the third best team in this league until proven otherwise. So you've got those 3, and then you have what makes this really interesting for me. Last season, your clear tier 2 were Union Berlin and Freiburg. Then you had Bayer Leverkusen, Eintracht Frankfurt, Wolfsburg behind them. And if you want to throw Borussia Mönchengladbach, who had a poor season in there because, they're usually in that Champions League conversation, in the Europa League conversation, that's fine. You can put them in that tier 3 too. Now you've kind of switched the roles here to a certain extent. Union Berlin, Champions League responsibilities. Freiburg playing in Europe again. You've got some of these other teams that don't have those European responsibilities and don't have those extra games. And these are also the teams that you're generally expecting to take those 4th, 5th, 6th spots. Your Leverkusens, your Mönchengladbachs, your Frankfurts, your Wolfsburgs. Can they at least get back into that conversation and enter the tier that Union Berlin and Freiburg appear to be in? And then the other part of this is, there have been some changes at those 2 clubs. Union Berlin have really reloaded to try and reinforce that squad, bolster that squad, to be prepared to make a Champions League run and do what they need to do in the Bundesliga. So I'm curious to see if they can actually pull it off, because so often you see teams struggle with those dual responsibilities. And even last season, the Union Berlin team that showed up in the Europa League was not the same one playing in the Bundesliga every weekend. You could tell that it took a toll on them. It just was the opposite of what it usually is. They didn't do well in Europe, as opposed to suffering in the league. So that is storyline 2 for me, is does this conversation get more interesting? Does somebody really go and claim that 4th spot? Is this just now the new order for a little while that Union Berlin and Freiburg back it up? And are the 2 teams battling for that last Champions League spot again? What does this ultimately look like? And then number 3, the new look attacks in this league. Obviously talked about Kane at Bayern Munich. What does that look like? It's just weird to think about Harry Kane not playing for Tottenham, And as I talked about before, how much does he actually elevate Bayern? All those things. Then, I also alluded to this. What's going on at Leipzig? Lois Openda, Benjamin Sesko in, Christopher Nkunku, Andre Silva out. You basically rebuilt your entire strike force. Leverkusen, you lost Moussa Diaby. Eintracht Frankfurt lost one of my favorite players in the world, Daichi Kamada. Marcus Thuram is no longer at Borussia Mönchengladbach. There were a lot of key attackers from this league last season that are no longer there. And you throw in the Harry Kane element of this as well. And so that's where, from Leipzig's standpoint, I'm still putting them in that tier with Dortmund and Bayern. But also, we need to see this work, because I've talked about this before. Christopher Nkunku is incredible. I don't think he gets enough credit for what he did for Leipzig. You're bringing in 2 strikers that haven't done it in this league before. Now, Lois Openda was phenomenal for Lens last season. I'm a big believer in his too. I think he's going to be fine. Benjamin Sesko, we're talking about a step up in competition level. But sometimes you get to Leipzig and it just doesn't work for whatever reason. Or you're Timo Werner and it doesn't work when you leave Leipzig. So that is the other storyline here for me, is that there have been a lot of pieces that have moved around for some of the teams that are expecting to be competing at the top of this league, whether that is additions or primarily subtractions, or in Leipzig's case, a little bit of both. Is there a departure that really is the one that stands out, that hurts a team? Is there somebody that arrives that just hits the ground running? Does Lois Openda go score 20-plus goals again? Because that's what Leipzig have to replace. They got an awfully good player to do it. But you just never know until you actually see it happen. So that is storyline 3 for me. That is the Bundesliga. Moving now to La Liga, starting with, I'm just calling it the title race. Really, it's the Real Madrid Barcelona storyline. Can Real Madrid keep pace with Barcelona? Can Barcelona replicate their pace from last season? Didn't start great in their opener. Does Real Madrid just become the best team in this league? Can Atletico Madrid, who had a sort of strange season where it looked like everything was falling apart and then they were phenomenal for a while, can they get into that conversation? Because they were right there with Real Madrid last season. I keep harping on this point. I'm not going to excuse Real Madrid's poor La Liga season because, they did it in the Champions League again, which they didn't even win the Champions League. But I'm not just going to dismiss that they were bad last season. Now, it's entirely possible, especially with the addition of Jude Bellingham, they're the best team in the league this season. But I'm still going to trust the team that showed up every week last season until I see something different. Now, by the way, they added İlkay Gündoğan. And if you're going to put Real Madrid in that conversation, you have to put Atletico because they were right there in terms of final point total from last season. So there's a lot going on here. Carlo Ancelotti, all of the Barcelona stuff off the field, the new signings, Jude Bellingham. Does Mbappe end up at Real Madrid? It's seeming like that's not going to be the case. I'll talk about that in a minute. All of that, just what does the top of this league look like? Do we actually get this title race that on paper it looks like there should be, at least between Barcelona and Real Madrid? Then second is specifically the Champions League spots for me. Because you had a pretty clear delineation last season. As I mentioned, you had your top three teams, no surprise there. Then you had Real Sociedad, and then Villarreal and Real Betis were behind them. And you look at those teams now, Real Sociedad has swapped strikers. One Leipzig one in, one Leipzig one out. Villarreal, the players who are gone, this should not get overlooked. Nicholas Jackson, Pau Torres, Samuel Chukwueze, and I know he wasn't really there last season either, but Arnaud Danjuma. Can Villarreal, with those losses, improve to get to a Champions League spot? Can Betis improve to get to a Champions League spot? Can Sociedad replicate what they did last season when they were clearly the fourth best team in the league? That's what I'm curious about here, is kind of how does that second group behind the favorites play out? Do we get a more exciting race for fourth place? And then the other thing I want to mention real quickly that I'll be paying attention to is the relegation battle. And it's for this very specific reason. Almeria, Valencia, Getafe, Cadiz, and Celta Vigo all survived by 3 or fewer points last season. This was the relegation battle in Europe, at least in the top 5 leagues. I know that the Premier League had a really good one that went down to the final seconds of the season, with multiple teams still in the mix there. But it wasn't anything like this, where just everybody was still in the thick of the relegation race for so long. So do we get a replication of that? None of these teams can go into the summer feeling good about this, considering how last season went. So do we have another, pretty clear bottom here where there are just a bunch of teams desperate to avoid relegation, or do a couple of these teams give themselves some breathing room and the relegation battle is not as interesting? That is La Liga. Moving to Ligue 1. All kinds of interesting things to talk about here, starting, of course, with PSG and Kylian Mbappe. This is also where I'll acknowledge Neymar is, on his way to Saudi Arabia. To me, it's the best piece of business PSG could have done to maximize the profit and just part ways with them, say we're done. I'm not shocked that there seemed to be very little interest from the rest of Europe, the teams he would actually go play for. Because to me, it's a similar story to Cristiano Ronaldo. It's not that he can't play at that level, because obviously, I think he's only 31. The injuries have been the biggest part. He's incredibly talented. but it's whether he is going to elevate your team enough to justify the salary you're going to have to pay him. And if you're Chelsea, Manchester City, Barcelona, if they had the money, whoever, to me, the answer to that is no. There's just more efficient ways to spend your money than going to get an injury-prone, often distraction-causing Neymar. Saudi Arabia, obviously happy to have him. That was the way to go here. On to the Mbappe part of this. So apparently now there's conversation about him signing this contract extension he said he wouldn't sign. We'll have to see how this all plays out. I went in detail on kind of my thoughts about all of this in a previous show. You can go back and find that. So all I'm going to say is this. If you're PSG, I still would not trust anything, even if Mbappe signs an extension. Because the last time he signed one, 6 months later, there was talk about him leaving again. Now, the other part of that is, if he signs the extension, basically it seems like the plan is that PSG is going to get their money next summer when he goes to Real Madrid, as opposed to leaving for a free transfer. And then he can play this season, which the entire time was the best solution to this problem or this situation. I just don't understand the thought process that leads us back to this point, because the only reason not to sign the contract extension, if you're Mbappe, unless you didn't believe PSG were actually going to follow through and sell you, which if you have 1 year on your deal and you tell them you're leaving, they made it pretty clear they're going to sell you. Was to make sure that you get all of the money, because Real Madrid wouldn't have to pay a transfer fee. And now Mbappe is reportedly backtracking on that. So this just changes every week at this point. I still am at the same ultimate conclusion, which is the best possible solution for everybody is for him to sign an extension and then have an agreement that he is getting sold next summer. Who knows if that's actually what ends up happening. On PSG, just in general, my big question is, can they be a factor in Europe this season? Because this is an incredibly different team. And I'm a huge Gonzalo Ramos fan. I do like some of the pieces they brought in. But you go look at that team that took the field in their Liga opener, and it's a little bit different when Mbappe's on the field, but they just don't scare you. They're still probably the best team in this league, and I'll get to a little bit more of that in these next two storylines, but this is a completely different approach from PSG. It's one thing to be the best team in France. It's another thing to be a legitimate contender to win the Champions League, and I'm just not sure they are. So that's the other part of the storyline for me. Number 2, who is the challenger if we have a title race here? Can somebody hang with PSG? And obviously, not off to a great start for PSG. If there's a season to go get them, this is it. And, Lens kind of took them to the wire last season. The end table looks closer than it really was, because PSG got to kind of coast and drop more points at the end. But that Lens team that was so good lost 2 really, really important players in Seko Fofana and Luis Openda. Talked about Openda earlier with Leipzig. Those are not just guys that Lens can go replace and be the same team. So it's hard to, and usually when you have a team that has a season like that, think, the Monaco, the Lille team that won the league, it doesn't last. They don't really follow it up with another season that's quite as good. And a lot of that has to do with people poaching their players, which is what happened to Lens. So you're looking outside of that. I really like what Marseille did in this transfer window. Iliman Ndiaye, Ismail Yassar, Renan Lodi. Those are also the kind of players that I personally get really excited about, and also simultaneously recognize are not real needle movers when you're talking about winning Ligue 1. But if it all comes together, to me the best chance of dethroning PSG is Marseille. But if you don't have a clear contender and PSG is down, what does that say about the league as a whole? Which is really the other part of this storyline for me, is if these Eredivisie teams keep showing up and you have not just Ajax, but Feyenoord, PSV performing well in Europe and having competitive title races, we might need to start talking about a change in the fifth best league in the world. Don't think we're quite there yet, but this is a very important season for Ligue 1 to kind of solidify itself again and reestablish what it's going to be moving forward without PSG being a clear top 3 team in terms of talent in the world. There's just a lot of question marks for so many of these top teams. Which goes into the third storyline, which is, can somebody make a jump and get into that, top 3 conversation, maybe even get into the title race? And I'm specifically looking at the teams that finished outside the Champions League last season. So we're talking Lille, Monaco, and Lyon. Lille still have a lot of pieces from that title team. Haven't been the same team since, but it's still a very good team. Monaco still has a lot of good players. Lyon, obviously, Lacazette had a phenomenal season. They've got good. These teams have good foundations that you look at a Lens or a Marseille or a Rennes, and it's not like they're that far behind. So it could easily flip, and all of a sudden, Lyon is the team or Monaco is the team that ends up qualifying for the Champions League. So that's the other part of this for me, is what does that final grouping of all of these teams that you feel like you could put them in any order and it would make sense end up? Do we get somebody who really emerges, be it Lyon, Monaco, Lille, somebody unexpected, and really kind of gets into that conversation with the Marseilles of the world? That is all for Ligue 1. Moving on to Serie A. Storyline number 1. It's the title race, because who in the world knows what's going to happen in this league, which is what makes it so fascinating. What does Napoli do for an encore? Pretty much held that team together. Obviously lost Kim, who is not easy to replace. But other than that, it's not like it was a fire sale. Most of that team is still there. Can they repeat what they did last season? I'm leaning toward no. But then again, I thought they were going to take a step back last season, so I can't really put a lot of stock in anything I believe about Napoli at this point. And then you're looking at the other teams. Inter, AC Milan, Juventus. Can Lazio elevate? I don't see that with Sergej Milinkovic-Savic leaving, but also brought in some new interesting pieces that I like. That's always what makes this league fascinating, is that you have 7 teams, and you've had 4 of them. Yeah, 4 of them, I had to check my math, win this league recently. It's really hard to hold on to the Scudetto once you have it. And so, can Napoli do that? If not, who is the team that shows up, or do we get a thrilling 4-way title race because nobody can separate themselves? Then, number 2, everything that's happened in Milan with both clubs. Inter, Christian Islani, Jan Sommer, Marcus Thuram, Juan Cuadrado, all joining. Specifically interested in Marcus Thuram and what he can bring to that team. Andre Onana, Marcel Brozovic, Robin Gosens, Milan Skriniar out. Now, Skriniar was basically gone last season anyway, so he's not exactly a big loss because he wasn't getting on the field. Jan Sommer is a good replacement for Andre Onana. Not the same keeper with his feet, but a guy who has given Bayern Munich all kinds of trouble. So you do feel good about his ability to kind of keep you in a game and make those fantastic saves. There's just a lot of movement here. And this is an Inter team that simultaneously, and still working on the Lukaku situation. We'll see how that ends up. And I'll go back to what I said about Inter with the Champions League final. They are really good at what they do. And they also just weren't good last season. Both of those things can be true. Because they got going a little bit once they, and Lukaku talked about this, once they went back to their foundation. But it's not like they were impressive. And AC Milan were even less impressive. So you gotta take it to another level if you're going to go win this league. And then AC Milan. The big criticism I had of that team last season is outside of Rafael Leao, they had nobody to create goals and to score goals. So you bring in Samuel Chukwueze, Christian Pulisic, Yunus Musa, Ruben Loftus-Cheek, and Noah Okafor, while losing Sandro Tonali, who is going to be a big loss, but also if Yunus Musa is the guy that's going to kind of take that spot, I feel okay. Is he Sandro Tonali? No. But if you're making that sacrifice in midfield to add Christian Pulisic, Samuel Chukwueze, and Noah Okafor to your attack, I'll take it any day of the week. None of these guys are going to carry the attack by themselves. And you obviously also lost Brahim Diaz, who went back to Real Madrid. But that's what Leao is there for. You just need somebody to help him. And between those three guys, specifically Chukwueze and Pulisic, I feel like Milan is going to get what they need. And maybe it's not enough to go from where they were last season to being title contenders, because they were just that bad and that inconsistent. But I have a hard time believing they're going to struggle that much again. I really like what they did in this transfer window. One of my favorite favorite windows in Europe. So that is number 2 for me, is just kind of what do we get out of these Milan clubs? How do they follow up what they did in the Champions League? Interesting summers, all of that. And then you can't talk Serie A without talking Juventus. Not a lot happening in the summer. You know, Tim Weah joined. Got some loanees on permanent deals. That's about it, which is uncharacteristic for Juventus. We'll see if something happens before the window closes. But really, for me, this is about how do they handle finally knowing what their punishment is and that they're not going to be participating in Europe this season. Because it was going to be the Conference League anyway. Although, from a point standpoint, they qualified for the Champions League. But they already had the deduction in there. So, if I'm Juventus, I would rather not be playing in Europe than play in the Conference League. That's no disrespect to the Conference League. It's about the fact that I don't think they can win Serie A and play in the Conference League with their situation. If they just get to focus on Serie A, maybe they can do it. I'm not picking them. They're probably not the most talented team in this league on paper. But I am really curious and would not be stunned if they have a really, really good season with all the distractions behind them, no European competition to focus on, and just trying to reestablish themselves at the top of Serie A. Again, I don't know if they have the talent to do it, but I am very curious about that, and I expect them to be much better and to be a factor at the top of the table in a way they haven't been the past couple seasons. That is all for storylines. I'm going to take my first break. When I come back, World Cup final preview time. Everything you need to know about the matchup between England and Spain. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. It is World Cup final preview time. Our final is set. Spain, England, two teams that have never been to a Women's World Cup final before. One of them is going to win it. Some really interesting storylines here. So it is time to break it all down. Starting with the numbers. Some interesting things I want to point out about this matchup and kind of how these teams have played in the tournament so far. These are all courtesy of FB Ref and StatsBomb, so shout out to FB Ref. Spain leads this tournament with an average expected goal difference of 2.47 per 90 minutes. So, right, per game, 2.47 expected goal difference. England is ninth at 0.78. Expected goals aren't everything, but they do tell a story. Now, that story can be a couple different variations. It can be a story about missed opportunities. It can be a story about dominance. Or it can be a story about a team not being good at finishing. And I'm going to get back to that kind of at the end when I talk about the keys to this game in particular. But it is worth pointing this out, that from a balance of play standpoint, a chance creation standpoint, Spain have been far and away the best team in the tournament, and England have not been particularly good. Which matches kind of what you've seen from England, where they haven't been all that convincing most of the time, particularly when Lauren James hasn't been on the field. Speaking of Lauren James is second in this tournament in goals plus assists per 90 minutes at 1.89. And I didn't actually look at the numbers, but I believe that she has the highest goals plus assists per 90 minutes of players who have played a significant number of minutes. I'd have to go double check on that. But the point is that when she's been on the field, she's been terrific. Arguably the best player at this tournament. And England have struggled somewhat without her. Now she's back. And I'm not going to get too much into this yet because it's going to really come back later in this preview. But just to put in perspective how good she's been. Goal contributions per 90 minutes, she is second in the tournament. Third thing, I just kind of found this interesting, so I wanted to throw it out there. These two teams, Spain first, England second, pass completion percentage in this tournament. One of the reasons for that is something I'm going to talk about later, so I'm not going to spoil it here. But that tells you something about the way these teams play and where their strengths are. That's no surprise for Spain. England maybe a little bit more so, but you've got a really good midfield that can really pass the ball. And so the passes are getting completed by both of those teams. I don't have too much in terms of takeaways from that. I just wanted to point it out. Number 4. Spain, first in shot creating actions per 90 minutes, just over 39. Second in goal creating actions per 90 minutes, 3.79. Again, going back to the goal difference thing. Nobody has been better at creating chances in this tournament than Spain. Now, the team ahead of them in goal creating actions, I believe, was Japan, who were just really good at finishing. And were playing ridiculously well until they lost to Sweden. In a game that they probably should have won. So outside of that, but from a just creating opportunity standpoint, Spain have been the best team in this tournament. And then finally, you've got 6 players who started the Champions League final for Barcelona playing in this game. You've got Lucy Bronze and Kira Walsh for England, Irene Perez, Tania Bomati, Salma Periuelo, and Mariona Caldente for Spain. And, Alexia Putellas came off the bench at the very end of the Champions League, if I remember correctly. My point is just, A, these players know each other. Obviously, they all played together at Barcelona this season. And B, for teams that don't have experience in these kind of environments, and, England have played in a final, England have been to World Cup semifinals, but also you had the advantage of the home crowd, so it's going to be different in a neutral venue that's thousands of miles away from England. These players do have big time experience, even though they haven't been to the spot in a World Cup. In Spain in particular, having a foundation of players who have played in Champions League finals really helps. So I just wanted to kind of go back and look at that starting lineup from the Champions League final. Over half of it is theoretically going to play in this game, which is really interesting to me. Then we get to the big question. And my big question here is kind of different than most of the ones that I come up with. It is who gets the tactics in the lineup right. Because both of these teams have had different evolutions throughout this tournament. This is not England at the Euros, who started the same 11 players every single game. This is an England team that switched formations, that then didn't have Keira Walsh, and then didn't have Lauren James, and the two of them have not played in this new 5-3-2 together. There's a lot going on there. And it changes Keira Walsh's responsibilities. It moves who your starting 11 is because you're bringing in an extra center back. And we haven't seen Lauren James work in this system for the most part. So does Lauren James, now that she's eligible to play, come back into the starting lineup? To me, the answer is that she has to. But also the player who took her spot scored a really good goal in the semifinal and has a tendency for coming up with big goals in Ella Toon. What does that formation from Serena Wiegman look like? Is it going to be the 5-3-2? Are they going to go back? Because part of that was to, compensate for not having Keira Walsh. Really interested in that part of it and whether Lauren James gets her spot back. Then, on the Spain side, 14 different players have started half of these games, 3 or more. You don't see that very often. It's not just that they've rotated a little bit. It's that players have been in and out of the starting lineup. And so Jorge Vilda has some decisions to make here. Does Alexia Putellas start? She had been dropped for a little bit, then she got put back in. Hasn't been particularly impactful. It also just takes one game where, it would never be shocking if she just looks like the best player on the field at any given moment. She could just wake up Sunday and everything looks normal again. Who knows? So what is the 11 that Spain actually go with? Is Putellas in it? How does all of that kind of get put together? And then substitutions as well. These teams both have more than 11 starters. So how do you utilize those players coming off the bench that can be real difference makers? If you're England, you know exactly what you're getting in Spain in terms of philosophy. How does Serena Wiegman deal with that? There's some really interesting tactical and kind of lineup-based questions that to me are going to be the thing that determine this game. Is which manager do you come out of this feeling like they got it right? The matchup I'm looking at. Keira Walsh, Aitana Bonmati. Not necessarily that they're always going to be going up against each other, but these might be the best two kind of pure midfielders in the world at this moment in time. I don't need to keep harping on about how important Keira Walsh is to England. Aitana Bonmati has been phenomenal for Spain. She's right there in terms of the best players in the world. And they both do some of the same thing, which is kind of be the creative, and maybe even creative force isn't really accurate for Keira Walsh, because obviously Bonmati is much more involved in actually making goals happen. But they are the heartbeat. They are the foundation of everything in that midfield. And so in a game where you have really good midfielders supporting both of them, in your potentially your Alexia Putellas, your Georgia Stanways, your Lauren Jameses, whoever it's going to be, which of these players really puts their imprint on the game? And I guess the similarity is coming from this idea that, and I know Bonmati scored some goals, but you might not necessarily see the impact on the scoreboard or on the defining plays of the game. But I cannot wait for this matchup because this is one of my favorite positions in the field to talk about and to watch, specifically Kira Walsh. It's the same, I was talking about this with Sandro Tonali. There's a reason that people are paying premium money for this position now. These number 6, these deep lying playmakers, you can have different variations of it. But the dynamic two-way players that just make everybody else's lives easier and do all the things that you don't notice unless you're looking for them. We've got probably the 2 best in the world at it in this game. They're not the same kind of player. Like I said, Bomani's, more goals, more assists, some more creativity, more involved in the attack. But they hold a similar place in terms of their importance to these teams for me. And they might just be the best 2 players in the world in the midfield category at this moment in time. So that's the matchup for me. Which of those players are we talking about more by the end of the game? The X Factor, not a particularly difficult decision. It's Samuel Paralluelo. Samuel Paralluelo has completely changed the dynamic of Spain's last 2 games. They might not still be in this tournament if it wasn't for Paralluelo. She has been sensational coming off the bench, which is part of, again, these lineup decisions. She deserves to start, but also what she gives you off the bench. If you can keep it close for 70 minutes, keep it tied. The last 2 games, Paralluelo's come in and more or less decided the game in Spain's favor. So that is the 2 parts to this X Factor for me. 1, she has been the X Factor the past 2 games. You see it when she comes in. Everything changes. She is so energetic, so dynamic. She just pops off the screen. And the other part is, can she do it again and how does she get utilized? Because it's a different situation if you're starting. You're not going to see the same kind of energy for 75, 90 minutes if she's in the starting lineup. I'm a firm believer just in sports in general that your best, and it's a little bit different in soccer because you can't just sub all the time like you can in basketball. But your best lineup doesn't always include your best 11 players. It's about managing for 90 minutes. Honestly, I would probably keep her on the bench and just say, I know you want to start like everybody else. What we need from you is to be on the field when the game's going to get decided in those final 15 minutes in extra time, whatever it might be. You've proven to be the decisive factor in that moment. We want to do that again. So, Samuel Paralluelo, X Factor, definition of X Factor. The way she has performed the past 2 games for Spain. Last section here, England win if. I kept this pretty simple. Lauren James is the same player she was before she got suspended. There's the emotional, mental side of that suspension. The fact that she missed these World Cup games. Her team almost got eliminated with her on the sidelines. The guilt that's associated with the actual incident. Then there's also just getting back into game, up to game speed. And oh, by the way, it's the World Cup final. Welcome back. But she's been so good when she's been on the field. And you have Kira Walsh to take away some of that dynamism from Spain's midfield. Whether that's Balmati, whether that's Putellas. I just look farther up the field. And if England get the same Lauren James with Alessia Russo and Lauren Hemp, I just have a hard time seeing Spain win this game. Because the goals were a little bit more free-flowing when Lauren James was still out there. And I know they did score, 3 against Australia and kind of got some rhythm back offensively after struggling for a while. But it hasn't been all that pretty. I still think though that they are better equipped because, and I talked about this at the Euros too. What Serena Wiegmann has done such a good job of is finding the balance between the pragmatism and letting these incredible attackers go. It's something Gareth Southgate has really struggled to figure out. And the balance hasn't been quite as good in this tournament as it was at the Euros. But here they are. It's not about looking pretty. And I just think Lauren James decides this game if she's good to go and looks like the same player she was, which she could have not looked like that player had she continued on in this tournament. She was on a whole nother planet. But if she comes back and she's that player, I only see one winner, and that's England. On the Spain side, Spain win if the attack shows up and they don't make mistakes. And by attack shows up, I mean put the ball in the net and capitalize on your chances. Because for all of the XG and the shot creating actions that I love to talk about, it hasn't been spectacular over these past few games. It's looked difficult at times. And they needed Paralluelo to come in and provide a spark because it was kind of lifeless. That's the first part of this. You can have all the possession in the world you want, all the shots in the world you want. If you don't actually create good chances, if you don't actually break teams down, it doesn't matter. The question is not whether you're dominating play. The question is whether the other team feels uncomfortable. Who, and maybe that's just the ultimate question that needs to get answered. Who feels like the game is being played more on their terms and who is more comfortable with what is happening? Because Spain's men's team has fallen into this trap on multiple occasions. Yeah, the numbers look great. You outshot them 22-2. Did you actually threaten the goal? No, not really. So that's got to, and this Spain team hasn't had one go-to scorer. It's been a team effort through and through. Does somebody rise to the occasion and can they put the ball in the back of the net? The other part of this, I said, don't make mistakes. And this is where I want to point out what has happened to England the last 2 games. Go down against Colombia. And where did that goal come from? Goalkeeper mistake. Lauren Hemp just kind of sticks around, gets her foot in there, and pokes the ball into the net. All of a sudden, it's 1-1. Going into halftime, you feel much better. They come out second half, improved performance, take care of Colombia. Then the semifinal. Get the goal. Great goal from Elatoon. Sam Kerr, even better goal, probably. And all of a sudden, the entire country of Australia is coming down on you. And they believe that the Matildas are about to go take this game over. And where does the goal come from? Ellie Carpenter, Mackenzie Arnold, miscommunication, and there's Lauren Hemp again to put the ball in the net. Now, credit to Lauren Hemp for just not giving up on these plays and making people execute. 2 games in a row, she has come up with massive goals out of nothing. So that's the other key here for me if I'm Spain. Maybe they're just going to beat you because they're better on this day and Lauren James is spectacular, Alicia Ruscio is spectacular, whatever it might be. What I do not want, if I'm Spain, is to beat myself and to gift them a goal. Because that has changed so much these last 2 games. What happens if Lauren Hemp doesn't get her foot on that loose ball against Colombia? What happens if Ellie Carpenter communicates with Mackenzie Arnold and that ball gets cleared out for a corner or something? Who knows? England very well may not be here. And so for Spain, it's got to be two different parts to this for me. You can't just sit there and pass the ball around without creating good chances. You got to create good chances and you got to convert on them. And you also have to make sure that if you go ahead, you don't let England right back into the game, because that's the other part of this for Spain. They had a tendency to do that. Now they found a way to come back both times, but that's part of the way of the story too, is that there have been some very quick goals conceded after taking late leads. England have just found a way to continue to score the goals they need to, and a lot of that has been just putting pressure on opponents who have not dealt with it well. If you're Spain, you've got to be prepared for that, and you've got to just mentally stay engaged and make sure you don't gift England another goal. Because they've been pretty good about not giving up leads and not panicking if they do concede like they did against Australia. And for that reason, I'm going with England. I kind of hinted at this earlier. I just think they're the most complete team in terms of what it takes to win tournaments. Now, I also had them losing to Germany in the quarterfinals or something. So it's not like I'm sitting here saying I told you they were going to be here. But in this matchup in particular, I also didn't think Spain was going to be here. Full credit to those players for sticking together, finding a way to work together with all the tension and all the stuff going on off the field. I just feel more confident in the balance England has when Lauren James is on the field in particular. That you've got dynamic attackers. Her, Russo, have been chipping in goals. You've got Kira Walsh to mitigate the Bonmatis and Putellas in midfield for Spain. If you go 3 at the back, that's an extra defender. And I do like what that does for Lucy Bronze and Rachel Daly. I just, top to bottom, I just love the multi-dimensional nature of this England team. And anybody who's listened to me knows how big I am on that when it comes to major tournaments, just tournaments in general. They can play from behind if they need to. They've proven that. They're tough to break down if they go ahead. It took a brilliant effort from Sam Kerr. They also have, players that can come in and make a difference. Ella Toone, Chloe Kelly. They've got the players who can go provide the moment of brilliance and be the best player on the field. Elisa Russo, Kira Walsh. They just check every box. And I know it hasn't been particularly pretty. But I'll take the team that's learned how to win that way over the team that I still just have this mental hurdle with Spain when it comes to major tournaments in this style of play. And maybe that's unfair to lump the women's team in there with the men's team. But we're talking about Barcelona, we're talking about Spain. The philosophy is incredibly similar. They're phenomenal to watch, great players. This should be a really good game. Give me the Lionesses. Maybe we're having a different conversation if Spain is at full strength. But I've just seen too many times where there aren't enough ideas in attack. And I just don't think England are going to beat themselves. That's the other part of this. Somebody has to actually go beat them, and nobody has yet. That is the World Cup final preview. I'm going to take one more break and finish with the weekend look ahead. So stay tuned for that. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show one final time. It is time for the weekend look ahead. So much to get to. Obviously, I already talked about the World Cup final at great length, so I'm not going to discuss that here. If you haven't seen that video yet, be sure to check it out. Everything else going on. Starting with League's Cup. Third place game final. Monterrey at Philadelphia Union for the third place game on Saturday. And then the grand finale, Inter Miami at Nashville, Geodis Park later Saturday night, for the trophy. I'm not going to get too deep into all of this. I have thoughts I'm kind of saving for when this actually ends. That'll be included in my weekend roundup video. Here's all I'm going to say, though. The Philadelphia Union had not lost a home game in which Andre Blake was in net since I believe it was May 1st, 2021. And Inter Miami went in there and immediately scored, and then Messi scored, and then Jordi Alba scored, and the game was kind of over, and then the Union kind of got back into it, and then there was the fourth goal to put it away. We're getting so obsessed with Messi, and I get it. It's Messi. What he's doing is incredible. He can't stop scoring all that. I'm going to save some of this for the weekend roundup. But let's just give this team their due and not make this about trashing MLS. Like I said, that team hadn't lost at home in over 2 years with something close to a full strength squad. And I know that the strikers weren't healthy, so you could say this even wasn't a full strength squad, but there was one team that deserved to win that game, and it's Inter Miami. And most of the Union players were there. It's not supposed to be this easy. If it was this easy, every big name that came over would be doing this. And they don't. It's a combination of a lot of things, and I'm going to save all of that to see if Inter Miami actually pull this off. But all I want to say is now is there's no need to continue to make this some kind of commentary on MLS. I didn't think Miami were going to be this good. And I continue to stand by my belief that this league is better than people give it credit for. I am choosing to give this as a round of applause and all the credit to Miami rather than this making it a commentary on everybody else. Go ask anybody else in the league how difficult it is to do what Miami did last night. Absolutely incredible. And Nashville get by Monterrey. I'm going to say it here. Two teams most equipped to deal with this Miami team are Philly and Nashville. Now, Union just shot themselves in the foot too many times. Nashville get a clean slate. Defensively, what they can do. If Miami gets through this game too and makes it look pretty easy, this might just kind of be a wrap by the time next season starts. I do think this is going to be much more competitive. I would not be surprised at all if Nashville win. This should be a really good game. And continuing in MLS, the regular season is also returning this weekend. A couple games I wanted to highlight. Cincinnati at Columbus. Gotta love when the Ohio teams meet. That is on Sunday. And Atlanta at Seattle also on Sunday. Columbus, can you kind of get this thing going? Get back into a rhythm. I'm really, really high on this team. Haven't quite lived up to expectations yet, although it's starting to get better. And Cincinnati, this is one of those games you look at and you maybe don't expect to come away with 3 points. You're running out of those games where they're not getting 3 points to keep this Supporters Shield race close. If they get 3 points here, they are well on their way to cruising to a Supporters Shield title. NWSL also back in action. Angel City at Louisville on Saturday. Huge game with playoff implications. Then Gotham at San Diego Wave also on Saturday, later Saturday night. Two of the best teams in the league battling at the top of the table. And then North Carolina Courage at Portland Thorns on Sunday. Another matchup of two of the better teams in the league. Now we get to Europe. Going to go pretty quickly here. England, Manchester United at Spurs on Saturday. Not great from United to start. Fine by Spurs. First home game in the Ange Postecoglou era. All kinds of interesting things there. Newcastle at Manchester City on Saturday. These teams are always fun when they meet. Newcastle's got a brutal schedule to start the season. If they can even come away with a point here, and they can keep this going, we're only a few weeks away from them needing to be considered legitimate title contenders. Now, a lot has to go right in those couple weeks. But if they get a point here, another win next week, this is becoming on the verge of becoming real very quickly. Again, not there yet. Got to see how this game goes. But if they have a good performance at the Etihad, this is going to get real interesting. And then Everton at Aston Villa on Sunday. Everton, can you put some points on the board? Villa, how do you bounce back from the Newcastle game? Spain, Real Madrid at Almeria on Saturday. Cadiz at Barcelona on Sunday. Can Barcelona avoid falling too far behind in the title race? And then your game of the weekend, Atletico Madrid at Real Betis on Sunday. Italy, not the most enticing matchups to start the season, but nevertheless, Napoli begin their title defense at Frosinone on Saturday. Monza at Inter on Saturday, and then Juventus at Udinese on Sunday. Bundesliga, some interesting games to start the season as well. Bayern Munich at Werder Bremen on Friday. I will say this now. This game last season was the exact time everybody crowned Bayern Munich champions after they destroyed, I don't even remember who it was. Was it Leverkusen maybe? Somebody like that. And then they went on to have an awful season. Let's just pump the brakes, whatever the result is, good or bad for Bayern. Other games, Leipzig at Leverkusen on Saturday. That's probably your best one. And Cologne at Dortmund on Saturday as Dortmund begin to try and put behind them the incredibly disappointing end to last season. And then France, Marseille at Metz on Friday. PSG at Toulouse on Saturday. See if they can get going. And your game of the weekend, Rennes at Lens, two of the best teams from last season on Sunday. Lens could use a win at home to get some momentum going after a not-so-great opener. That is all for the weekend look ahead. That is all for the Touchline Talk Show this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in.